Okay, these next couple of sections will be about water and water availability and application. I believe your chapter 6 discussed the value of water and water pollution levels. So here we have a picture of a young child playing with something. It could be a lightsaber, it could be a baseball bat, and that's this young lad is having a whole bunch of fun. It's probably a very hot day somewhere in the United States of America, and I think the idea is that water is oftentimes allocated in not the most efficient manner, and the pricing is not allocated. So we have water flowing freely through sprinklers. Stories abound of people washing their cars and letting the water just run away. Water is a very, very valuable resource, and we economists believe that it should be priced accordingly. Okay, and it's a replenishable resource that has been exploited to a great degree. Now, unlike oil, there's no alternative resource to switch to. I mean, we may drink soda, we may not hydrate nearly as much, but for our body survival, we need water. There is nothing else to switch to but water indeed. Now, water, no pun intended, on the surface is quite abundant, but having it where it is needed is indeed quite a problem. And in and in plantation days, I know, especially on Oahu, but even on the other islands, the plantation era had some had a basic problem of the windward versus the leeward sides. The windward sides would have the water, and the leeward sides would not. But the leeward sides, it's not now, but back in the day, maybe your parents and grandparents' day, probably your grandparents worked on the plantations. Where were the plantations? They were on the leeward sides of the island. Um, but sugar needed a lot of water. It wouldn't rain in the leeward side. So how to get the water from the windward side that had a lot of water to the leeward sides? Well, there were lots of canals and ditches and diversion of water from the windward to the leeward side that was built in the early part of the 20th century. Of course, had some problems with the with the natural ecosystem of the windward side, but it did solve a basic problem of getting the water from windward over to the leeward side to fuel the sugar plantations and maybe even population centers that were on the leeward or the south sides of Oahu, uh, and diverting that water from the windward side. Okay, next few slides will be some interesting interesting slides that I got from other sources. In particular, when I went over to Brooklyn College in the fall of 2017, I got this really neat slideshow on water. So our first one is global freshwater availability, and you can see the more brown areas is where water tends to be scarce. And then as we get to blue and even darker blue, this is where water is much more available. So you can see North America and especially Canada, a lot more water relative to Northern Africa and and the Middle East, India. There's a big stress on water. China, there's a bit of stress on water. So water is distributed unevenly, although there is plenty of water, shall we say, but it's very unevenly distributed. Our next slide here shows the natural water footprint for selected countries in cubic meters per person per year. So this shows that the USA uses a lot of water for agricultural. We use the most per person. Looks like about 2,500 cubic meters per person. Um, what's interesting is that Italy and Thailand are very close, but the use of water for agriculture is far dwarfs that of the United States. In Indonesia, almost no industrial and domestic water. It is almost entirely agricultural. So very, very interesting slide here. Here's another one that shows physical versus economic water scarcity. And again, it kind of matches the slide you saw a couple of slides ago. North America tends to have little or no water scarcity, although I can see that in the southwest part of the United States, lots of physical water scarcity there, and then water scarcity throughout northern China, Saudi Arabia, North Africa, whereas Europe tends to have little or no water scarcity. And even in Australia, we have approaching physical water scarcity around Sydney and Melbourne. So Australia has had lots of droughts. And then we can see economic water scarcity, I guess, lack of access to water, even though the water might be there, in the middle part of Africa. And this shows virtual water, where the where water goes in the production of each good. Just very interesting as we go from a sheet of paper through agricultural items, and then look how much water is needed for making a hamburger, for a cotton t-shirt, for even a pair of shoes, bovine leather, I guess, raising the cow to make the pair of shoes. Quite amazing how much water is needed for these various items that we all as humans consume. Now this slide shows the cycle of water. So there is the hydrological cycle of water. As defined in your book as moisture falls to the earth as precipitation and returns to the atmosphere via evaporation and transpiration from plants, replenishes some of our water supplies. So the picture there shows just how water cycles from the ground up to the sky and then back. Surface water is defined as lakes, rivers, and oceans that receives runoff from watersheds. Groundwater is accumulated over millennia in underground aquifers of sand, gravel, and fractured rock. So that's the groundwater, and we have major aquifers here on Oahu. And speaking of aquifers, there are aquifers. And those are storage, natural storage containers of water underneath the ground. Now, how much water is replenishable into aquifers? In your book, about 2.5% of the extractable groundwater in the United States is replenishable by percolation seepage into aquifers. And how much water is depletable? The remainder, I guess that would be 97.5%, is depletable in the sense that after it is mined, water will no longer be available from that groundwater source. Now, apparently it will, I guess it comes back down as rain, but the real replenishable part is only 2.5%. Okay, this finishes off this portion, and next we'll do a model of water and go into more detail about water rights and such.